Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're going deep, really deep into the world of trauma.
Buckle up.
We're diving into The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. Have you read this one?
I have, yeah. It's a powerful book. Really changed the way I think about trauma.
Well, that's what we're hoping to do today. Unpack how trauma affects us in ways we might not realize. And not just like mentally, but physically in our relationship.
Yeah, it's not just about forgetting or moving on. It's about how our bodies hold on to the experience.
Okay, so right off the bat, the book hit me with some heavy stats from the CDC.
Okay.
1 in 5 Americans sexually molested as children, 1 in 4 beaten by a parent. I mean, are you as floored by these numbers as I am?
It's definitely sobering. But van der Kolk doesn't just present these statistics to shock us,
Right.
He uses them to show that as humans, we're incredibly resilient. We can go through horrific things and still find a way to survive, to keep going.
But like you said, that resilience comes at a cost.
Exactly. There's a price to pay. And that's what this book is all about. How trauma, those experiences, leave a lasting impact on us.
So, like, it's not just a metaphor, right? Our bodies are actually changing because of these experiences. How does that even work?
It's complicated, but trauma can mess with our nervous systems, throw it all out of whack.
Okay.
It can leave us in the state of like hypervigilance, always on high alert, even when we're safe.
Like always in fight or flight mode.
Exactly. And that constant state of stress, it takes a toll on our sleep, our focus, relationships, our health.
So how does this body-keeping score idea actually play out in real life? Like, what does that look like?
Well, the book is full of examples. One that stuck with me is Tom, this successful lawyer who served in Vietnam. He comes home, builds a life, seems to have it all, but he feels numb, can't connect with his wife, his kids, can't really feel joy.
Wow.
The trauma from the war, it basically shut him down emotionally.
That's so sad. And it shows how trauma isn't always obvious, right? It can be hidden.
Yeah.
Even in people who seem like they have everything together.
Yeah, and then there's Bill, another veteran, who has a flashback triggered by, wait for it, an ink blot.
An ink blot, like a Rorschach test.
Yep, during a therapy session. And years after Vietnam, that simple image sends him right back into the terror of war.
That's intense. It really shows that these memories aren't just like in our minds.
Right.
They're in our bodies too, just waiting to be triggered.
Exactly. And these flashbacks, they're not just memories, they come with physical sensations too. Racing heart, sweating, struggling to breathe, as if the body's reliving the event right along with the mind.
That's heavy. I knew trauma was serious, but I guess I never grasped how deeply it affects us on a physical level.
Yeah, it's more than just memories, and it's not always these big dramatic flashbacks. Trauma can show up in subtler ways too, like chronic pain, gut issues, even autoimmune disorders.
So things that seem totally unrelated to our past
Yeah.
could be rooted in trauma.
It's possible. And that's why understanding how the body keeps score is so important. It helps us understand these seemingly random symptoms and hopefully find a way to heal.
It makes me think about how often we go to the doctor with physical stuff, but never talk about our emotional past.
Right.
Like we're treating the symptom, but not the root cause.
Yeah. You're hitting on something important. Van der Kolk talks about how the medical field has kind of overlooked the role of trauma in illness.
Like they're focused on managing the symptoms, not understanding what's causing them in the first place.
Exactly. He talks about working in a psychiatric ward and seeing how many patients, especially women, had histories of abuse or violence in their past.
Wow.
And at the time, no one really paid attention to that. It was dismissed, like it was irrelevant to their current problems.
That's awful. Imagine going through something horrific and having your experiences brushed aside.
Yeah. And the book gives this powerful example. Sylvia, one of his patients, had a really bad reaction to a pretty routine medical procedure.
Oh no. What happened?
Well, it turns out the way she was positioned during the procedure, it mirrored something from her past trauma. And that triggered this intense fear and feeling of vulnerability.
That's a perfect example of how trauma can linger in our bodies and affect us without us even realizing it.
Yeah.
And if doctors aren't aware of that, they could be re-traumatizing their patients without knowing it.
Exactly. And that's why van der Kolk argues that we need a more holistic approach to healthcare, one that recognizes the mind-body connection and takes trauma into account.
Okay, so if our bodies are literally keeping score, what's happening in our brains? Are there like actual changes happening up there?
Oh, absolutely. The book gets into some really groundbreaking research using brain scans, showing how trauma impacts brain function. For example, they found that during flashbacks, Broca's area, the part of the brain that deals with speech, it basically goes offline.
So that's why people struggle to put traumatic experiences into words.
Yeah.
They literally lose the ability to talk about it.
Exactly. And it's not just Broca's area. Trauma also affects the amygdala, which controls our fear response.
Okay.
It makes people super sensitive to anything that feels threatening.
So everyday things might feel scary, even if they're not actually dangerous.
Right. And then there's the hippocampus, the part of the brain that handles memory. Trauma can mess with its functioning, too, making memories of the event fragmented and jumbled.
So it's not just about forgetting what happened, it's that the memory itself is distorted.
Exactly. It's like trying to piece together a puzzle where you're missing pieces.
This is all starting to paint a picture of how trauma throws our whole brain out of whack. Yeah. But there's more to the story, right?
There is. The book also explores how trauma affects our relationships with other people. And this is where things get really interesting.
Yeah, there's definitely more. The book talks about how trauma can affect our ability to form healthy relationships, which makes sense when you think about it.
Okay, I'm curious. How does trauma mess with our relationships?
Well, let's imagine for a second you're back in, say, elementary school.
Okay. You see a group of kids, they're all huddled together, whispering, laughing.
Mhm.
Do you feel drawn to them, like you want to join in?
Yeah.
Or do you kind of hesitate, feel unsure, maybe even a little anxious?
I think it would depend on my past experiences. If I've been bullied or excluded before, yeah, I'd probably be more hesitant.
Exactly. And that's what's so fascinating about trauma, right?
Okay.
It shapes our social engagement system. It's called the ventral vagal complex, or VVC. When we feel safe and connected, our VVC is activated. We can engage with other people, feel empathy, build relationships. But when we experience a threat, like trauma, our nervous system shifts gears. It goes into protection mode.
So instead of reaching out, we pull back.
Exactly. Another system takes over, the dorsal vagal complex, or DVC. This triggers what's called the freeze response, which makes sense as a survival mechanism, right?
Right.
But if it becomes our default setting because of trauma, it can lead to social isolation and trouble connecting.
So it's like our bodies learn to equate connection with danger, and we shut down to protect ourselves.
That's a great way to put it. And it can manifest in different ways, Someone who's neglected as a child might struggle to trust people and form close bonds. Someone who was bullied might become withdrawn, avoid social situations altogether.
It makes you wonder how much of our adult behavior is driven by these early experiences,
That's a major point the book emphasizes. Early childhood attachment plays a huge role.
Okay, let's talk about attachment. What exactly do we mean by that?
Attachment is the emotional bond that forms between a child and their primary caregiver. When a caregiver is attuned to the child's needs, provides consistent care and emotional support, the child learns that the world is safe and they are worthy of love.
So secure attachment is like a foundation for emotional well-being.
Exactly. But when that early attachment gets disrupted, through abuse, neglect, even just inconsistent care,
Right.
it creates a sense of insecurity, mistrust.
And that can lead to problems down the line, like struggling to form healthy relationships.
Right. And it can also make us more susceptible to the negative effects of trauma later on. The book tells this really poignant story about Sherry, this woman who had a very difficult childhood.
Oh, no.
She experienced neglect, was often left to fend for herself emotionally.
That's heartbreaking. It sounds like she never got the chance to develop that secure attachment.
Right. And unfortunately, this early neglect, it made her more vulnerable. As an adult, she was kidnapped and raped.
This really highlights how trauma can have these ripple effects, making us vulnerable in ways we don't even realize.
It's like a crack in our armor. And it's important to remember that trauma doesn't just affect individuals, right? It can impact entire societies. The book goes into the historical context of trauma, especially the effects of war.
That makes sense. War is a collective trauma. It affects everyone, not just the soldiers.
Exactly. Kolk discusses this book, All Quiet on the Western Front. It's a powerful novel that shows the psychological toll of World War I.
I read that in high school. It's so powerful. It really captures the despair and the disillusionment of those who went through it.
And that's exactly why the Nazis banned it. They burned it when they came to power.
Really?
Yeah. Because acknowledging the psychological wounds of war, that would have undermined their whole militaristic agenda.
It's like a classic example of those in power trying to silence or dismiss the experiences of those who've been traumatized.
Right. It happens over and over again throughout history, and it highlights how important it is to speak out, to advocate for the recognition and treatment of trauma.
Okay, so let's circle back to the individual experience of trauma for a moment. We talked earlier about how it can affect memory,
Right.
how traumatic memories can be fragmented and organized.
The book uses this really helpful analogy to explain this. It compares traumatic memories to a mosaic. You have all these separate pieces, a smell, a sound, an image, but they don't necessarily fit together to form a clear picture.
So instead of a coherent narrative, it's more like flashes of sensory detail.
Exactly. And this fragmented nature, it makes it really hard to process what happened, like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. It can leave people feeling confused, stuck, and unable to move forward.
It makes me think about how much we rely on language to make sense of our experiences.
Mm.
But if the part of our brain responsible for speech shuts down during trauma, how do we even begin to process those memories?
That's where the body comes in. Kolk emphasizes that the body remembers what the mind can't or won't.
Oh, interesting.
He shares all these examples of patients who developed physical symptoms, even illnesses, that mirrored their past traumas, even if they had no conscious memory of the events.
So it's like our bodies are trying to communicate something to tell us a story that our minds have blocked out.
It's a fascinating idea. There's this one story in the book about a woman named Nancy who developed this intense phobia of anesthesia.
Oh, wow. What happened?
She had what's called anesthesia awareness during a surgery, meaning she was conscious but completely paralyzed.
Oh, guys, I can't even imagine.
It's a rare occurrence, but incredibly traumatic. And initially, Nancy couldn't remember any specific details of the surgery. It was only through years of therapy and body work that she started to piece things together and connect her fear to that experience.
That's incredible. It really shows the power of the body to hold on to these experiences, even when the mind has shut them out.
And it underscores how important it is to pay attention to our physical sensations, They can be clues to understanding our past and navigating the path to healing.
So it's not just about talking through our problems, it's about listening to our bodies,
Right.
what they're trying to tell us.
Exactly. The body, in many ways, holds the key to understanding trauma and finding relief.
I'm starting to understand the phrase, the body keeps the score. More than just a clever phrase, It's this profound truth about how trauma affects us.
It is. And it has huge implications for how we approach treatment and healing.
That's what I'm curious about. If trauma is so deeply embedded in us, what hope is there for healing?
Well, the book doesn't offer any easy answers, but it does challenge a lot of the traditional approaches to mental health. Kolk says we need to move beyond diagnoses and labels and instead focus on understanding how trauma impacts a person's overall functioning.
So not just treating symptoms, but addressing the underlying trauma that's causing those symptoms.
Exactly. He emphasizes understanding how trauma affects our ability to connect with others, regulate our emotions, and feel safe in our own bodies.
It's about seeing the whole person.
Exactly. Not just a collection of symptoms. And this shift in perspective, it opens up possibilities for different types of healing.
So it's not about finding the one right therapy, but exploring different approaches, seeing what works for each individual.
Exactly. The book discusses a whole range of therapies, from traditional talk therapy to things like body-based practices, mindfulness techniques, even creative arts therapies.
It's about finding what helps people access and process those experiences, regulate their emotions, and reclaim their lives.
That's a great way to put it. Trauma can leave people feeling fragmented, disconnected. And healing often involves bringing those broken pieces back together, rebuilding that sense of wholeness.
What stands out to me is this idea that trauma isn't a life sentence. There's potential for healing, for growth, for transformation.
Absolutely. And the book really emphasizes the importance of social connection in that process.
So it's not just about individual therapy. It's about having a supportive community, feeling connected to others.
Exactly. Kolk even talks about the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission as this powerful example of the healing that can happen when we have collective acknowledgement and understanding.
Can you remind me what that was all about?
Yeah. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it was established after the end of apartheid in South Africa. It was a space for victims of human rights violations to share their stories and for perpetrators to confess their crimes. This process, as difficult as it allowed for a collective reckoning with the horrors of the past, and it laid the groundwork for healing and reconciliation.
It sounds like a powerful example of how facing trauma head-on both individually and collectively, can be the catalyst for healing.
It really is, and Kolk argues that we need to create similar spaces in our own communities and institutions.
So instead of sweeping trauma under the rug, we create environments where it can be acknowledged and addressed
Right. Yeah.
and ultimately healed.
Exactly. He talks about specific examples of how to do this, like implementing trauma-sensitive practices in schools. Instead of punishing kids for behaviors that might be stemming from trauma, teachers can learn to recognize the signs and respond in a way that makes those kids feel safe and supported.
That makes so much sense. It's
Yeah.
about creating a culture of understanding and support, not blame and punishment.
It can make all the difference in a child's ability to heal and thrive.
This is all so insightful,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm feeling a little overwhelmed by the sheer scale of it all, to be honest. If trauma is so widespread, so deeply ingrained, where do we even begin to address it?
That's understandable. It's a lot to take in, and that's where the book gets really interesting, actually. It explores some innovative and, let's be honest, controversial approaches to treatment, like using MDMA.
MDMA, like ecstasy.
Yeah, but used in a very controlled therapeutic setting. Researchers are looking at how it can help people with PTSD access and process traumatic memories
Yeah.
without being completely overwhelmed by fear and anxiety.
Wow. That sounds pretty intense. How does that even work?
Well, MDMA is known to increase feelings of trust, connection, compassion, and it also reduces activity in the amygdala, the fear center of the brain. This combination can create a really safe, supportive environment to revisit those traumatic experiences, to reprocess them in a more positive light.
So it's not about erasing the memories, but changing our relationship to them.
Exactly. The research is still in early stages, and it's important to emphasize this isn't a quick fix. It's not a party drug. It's a powerful tool that needs to be used responsibly, ethically.
I can see how it could be incredibly helpful for some people, but it definitely raises some ethical questions and potential risks.
Absolutely. The book acknowledges those concerns, emphasizes the need for careful research and regulation, but it also presents some pretty compelling anecdotal evidence from patients who've experienced profound healing through MDMA-assisted therapy.
It's fascinating, and it highlights how much we're still learning about the brain
Yeah,
and the potential for healing.
right. And the book stresses that there's no one-size-fits-all approach, Different types of trauma may need different types of treatment.
So what works for someone with PTSD from, say, a car accident might not be effective for someone who experienced years of childhood abuse.
Exactly. In those cases, therapies that focus on rebuilding a sense of safety and security, fostering healthy attachment, and developing emotional regulation skills might be more beneficial.
So it's not just about the traumatic memories themselves, but the underlying wounds, the developmental disruptions that trauma can cause.
Precisely. Trauma therapy is often a multifaceted journey. It involves healing on multiple levels. But beyond specific therapies, the book also talks about the power of something else: rhythm and movement.
Rhythm and movement, how does that tie into trauma recovery?
Well, think about it. Trauma often disrupts our natural rhythms, our sleep cycles, our eating habits,
Yeah.
even our breathing. And it can disconnect us from our bodies, leave us feeling numb or disembodied.
I know when I'm stressed, I tend to hold my breath,
Yeah.
clench my jaw, without even realizing it.
Exactly. And Kolk points out that traditional cultures have long used rhythm and movement. Think drumming, dancing, chanting to regulate emotions, process experiences, and foster community.
So tapping into something primal, instinctual, helping us reconnect with our bodies and regulate our nervous systems.
Exactly. And he suggests that these practices can be incredibly valuable tools for trauma recovery today.
That's so interesting. I've definitely felt how moving my body can shift my emotional state. Like when I'm anxious, going for a run or putting on music and dancing can really help.
That's a perfect example. Movement helps us regulate those emotions, reconnect with our bodies. And the book explores a whole range of practices, from yoga and meditation to martial arts, drumming circles, even theater.
Theater? That seems kind of unexpected.
It might seem counterintuitive, but Kolk argues that theater can be a really powerful way to access and express emotions, develop a sense of agency, and build relationships.
It's like you can step outside of yourself, explore different perspectives, different emotions in a safe environment.
Exactly. And he highlights several programs that are using theater as a therapeutic modality for trauma survivors, and they're seeing great results.
This is all starting to make sense. Trauma traps us in this cycle of fear and reactivity, and these rhythmic, movement-based practices can help us break free, reconnect with our bodies, find a sense of flow.
It's about reclaiming our innate capacity for regulation, for connection, for joy.
It's almost like rewriting the score of our lives, composing a new melody that reflects resilience and strength.
That's a beautiful way to put it. Trauma may leave its mark, but it doesn't have to dictate the whole symphony.
I love that. It's so hopeful. This has been an incredible conversation. We've covered so much ground, from the science of trauma to all these diverse paths to healing.
And we've seen how trauma is not just an individual issue, but a societal one, something that demands our attention, our compassion.
But before we move on, I think it's important to acknowledge that this conversation might be triggering for some people listening.
You're absolutely right. If you're finding this material difficult, please reach out for support. There are resources available, and you don't have to go through this alone.
And if this has piqued your interest, we highly recommend checking out The Body Keeps the Score yourself.
It's a powerful book, one that can really change the way you understand yourself, your relationships, the world around you.
This deep dive has been so eye-opening for me. It's really changed my understanding of trauma and how deeply it impacts us.
And I hope it sparks some curiosity for our listeners as well.
Definitely. There's so much more to explore. But for now, let's turn our attention to one final but crucial aspect of trauma recovery: the power of connection and community. We've talked about how trauma can make you feel isolated, alone, like you're carrying this weight by yourself. It makes me think about how important connection is, especially for healing.
That's such an important point, and it's something that Kolk keeps coming back to in the book. Trauma can really shatter our sense of connection,
Right.
make us feel like we don't belong, like we're broken somehow.
Yeah, like it creates this rupture almost in our relationships. It makes it hard to trust, to connect, to let people in.
Exactly, and that's why the idea of community is so powerful.
Yeah.
The book really highlights how healing it can be to share our experiences, to feel like we belong.
It reminds me of that South African concept,
Yes.
Ubuntu, right?
Yes.
I am because we are.
Ubuntu is such a beautiful way to describe this interconnectedness. It emphasizes that our humanity is bound up in the humanity of others. We're not meant to go through life alone, especially when we're facing tough stuff, like trauma.
So if trauma isolates us, healing requires us to rebuild those connections, to find a place where we feel safe and supported.
That's exactly it. And Kolk talks about creating what he calls trauma-informed communities as this powerful way to counteract the isolation of trauma.
Trauma-informed communities. Okay, I like that. What does that look like in practice? Is it just about like being nice to each other?
It's more than just being nice. It starts with awareness, recognizing how common trauma is, and understanding how it can affect people, families, systems even.
So not just knowing that trauma exists, but understanding how it can show up in people's behavior, their relationships.
Right. And it also means creating spaces where people feel safe enough to share their stories, to be vulnerable, to ask for help without feeling ashamed.
That's so important. Creating a culture of empathy and understanding. Not just for those who've directly experienced trauma, but for everyone. Because like you said, we're all connected.
We are. When one person suffers, we all suffer. That's Ubuntu.
Yeah.
And a truly trauma-informed community, it would also prioritize prevention.
So not just helping people heal from past trauma, but trying to stop it from happening in the first place.
Exactly. This might mean addressing systemic issues, things like poverty, discrimination, violence, all things that can contribute to trauma. It could also mean promoting healthy relationships, teaching parenting skills, and helping kids build resilience.
That sounds like a big undertaking. How do we actually make this happen? Where do we even begin?
It starts with each of us. We can start by becoming more aware of trauma in our own lives, learning about it, and challenging the stigma that often surrounds it.
Yeah, just having open conversations like we are right now could be a good first step.
Absolutely. Sharing our stories, listening to others, making space for dialogue, all of that can be healing. We can also advocate for trauma-informed practices in our schools, workplaces, healthcare systems.
Right. There are so many ways to get involved, from volunteering to supporting policy changes. It's kind of empowering to realize that we all have a role to play in creating a world where trauma is acknowledged and addressed.
We do. And that's a message I really hope people take away from this deep dive. Trauma is a heavy topic, for sure. It's real. It's all around us. But it doesn't have to define us. Healing is possible.
That's a powerful message of hope. This deep dive has been incredible. It's really changed how I understand trauma.
It's a complex issue, and I hope it sparks some curiosity for our listeners. If you want to learn more, definitely check out The Body Keeps the Score.
It's an amazing book. It can change how you see the world.
And remember, healing doesn't happen in isolation. We need each other. And together, we can create a world where trauma doesn't have the final word.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of trauma. We hope you learned something new today. And until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.